Picture yourself within the Victorian era, as one of the many going in droves to the big cities to seek their fortune. What kind of trade will you take up? You see, the Victorian era saw rapid industrial growth, lots of opportunity, but with that, a host of dirty, dangerous, and downright dreadful occupations. The poorest in society often toiled in horrific conditions just to survive, with no other choice but to carry on. I figured that we'd talk about 5 of these jobs today, and in part 2 of the video I'll talk about another 5 if there are enough comments requesting it. So, thank you in advance for liking and subscribing, and a greater thank you to those on the Patreon supporting the channel. Let us begin today as we go back to those miserable streets of Victorian London. Now, when we think of the Victorian era, we certainly have this image of a chimney sweep, don't we? We have those Dickensian stories that are somewhat responsible for putting this idea into our heads. And yes, the reality comes with a lot less singing and merriment. Cleaning soot from inside narrow chimneys, that was their responsibility. But the one thing that was true about the Dickensian method of showing us this kind of occupation was that, indeed, it was frequently young children who were doing this job. With a brush or scraper in hand, climbing boys, or sometimes girls, but usually boys, as young as 4 or even 5 years old, would shimmy up the flue to remove the accumulation of ash and soot. Not an easy job. They had to use elbows, knees, and just shimmy up with their backs to scrape the chimney walls as they made their way through narrow, winding brick passageways that in some places were only about 9 inches wide. While the child workers typically received only food, a place to sleep, or a meager wage for their dangerous labor, the older master sweeps, as they were called, oversaw them and collected fees from the clients. Of course, one can imagine that the conditions were notoriously terrible, and that is going to be a prevailing theme for this entire video. They came out of chimneys covered from head to toe in soot, working entirely without protective gear such as gloves or masks. Many lived in filthy conditions, with the master sweep after being sold by impoverished parents or as orphans. In order to keep the kids small enough to fit into chimneys, the masters had a very interesting method. They didn't give them much food. They gave them a little, but just enough to keep them thin enough to do the job. It was a very dark, claustrophobic, and difficult experience to breathe inside the flue. Their skin would be scraped and cut by the sharp bricks. A child would occasionally become trapped in a chimney too, frantic as they became wedged in the slender shaft. In severe situations, ruthless parents would even light a fire underneath to push a terrified child upward, putting them at risk of burns or asphyxiation, a practice which was, thankfully, later outlawed. Workdays began early in the morning, and might involve climbing and crawling up and down several chimneys throughout the town until they were just too tired to continue. Chimney sweeps had long-term health effects, as one can imagine. Lung damage and chronic respiratory issues were brought on by soot inhalation. Their skin was constantly irritated by coal tar and ash, which caused excruciating eye inflammation and coughing fits. One of the earliest known industrial cancers, actually, chimney sweeps cancer, was infamously common in teenage sweepers. There's only a few years you can go until you get something like that. In 1775, Sir Percival Pott actually discovered this disease, so this is quite early, a squamous cell carcinoma of the scrotum, and connected it to exposure to soot. Victims experienced potentially lethal foul sores, and they even got the name soot warts. Due to years of their bending, the developing bodies in narrow chimneys, many sweeps had malformed ankles, knees, and spines. Suffocation if trapped or unconscious in the smoke was a constant risk, as was falling from roofs and chimneys too. But surely they were well compensated for this. Well, I'm afraid not. Child chimney sweepers made very little money. The child climbers received little more than the bare necessities of food and shelter. Although a master sweep might charge his clients a few shillings per chimney, always somebody at the top. For their efforts, some kids got a few pennies or a small amount of food. In essence, rather than being paid workers, the majority of climbing boys were indentured servants. Chimney sweeping services were inexpensive and common in urban areas due to the low cost of child labor. Climbing boys were gradually replaced by professional adult sweeps with long brushes by the middle of the 19th century, but only after legislation and public outcry. Child sweeps have long been viewed as a depressing reality by society, to the point where they are mentioned in nursery rhymes and Victorian literature, such as the gloomy kids in William Blake's The Chimney Sweeper, which perfectly sums up the feeling of the daily life of those. Even though they knew a small child was scuttling throughout their chimney, many middle-class and upper-class homeowners simply chose to ignore the situation. Reformers such as Lord Shaftesbury eventually denounced the practice as what he said was barbaric. One can hardly argue with that. Although laws established age restrictions and licensing requirements for chimney sweepers were passed in 1840 and 1875, the covert use of minors persisted. As a result, Victorian society's perception of chimney sweepers changed from one of indifference to activism and compassion. By the late century, the once common climbing boy had become a poignant symbol of innocence lost to Victorian industry, represents the worst excesses of child labor. Well, we're off to a good start, aren't we? I told you that the tone of the video was going to be set from early on. Now, we have another one today that has a recognizable name in our modern era, but things certainly have changed quite a lot since the early times. That is the coal miner. The Industrial Revolution's grim foundation, of course, was the mining of coal, and Victorian miners, men, women, and of course children, toiled to extract this from deep underground seams. Typically, a collier would fill carts or baskets after hewing the coal at the coalface with a pickaxe. In some areas, women known as bearers might carry loads of coal on their backs, while children as young as 5 worked as trappers, opening and closing the ventilation doors, or hurriers, pulling heavy coal carts through low tunnels. In the mines, entire families frequently collaborated to increase productivity. Everybody, from the adult hewer to the youngest assistant, had to keep the coal flowing to the pit shaft, because miners were paid according to the quantity of coal they extracted, which sounds fair, until you realize how much they were getting paid. We'll get to that. Toil might include shoveling loose coal, loading it for hoisting to the surface, and swinging a pick for hours in the dark. Coal mines in the Victorian era were notoriously unforgivingly underground. Because tunnels were frequently small and low, passages could only be 2 to 4 feet high. Miners, particularly the young ones, were forced to stoop or crawl while working. Due to the time and financial costs involved, mine owners rarely expanded tunnels beyond what was required. The atmosphere was usually damp, heavy with coal dust, and faintly lit by candles or oil lamps. Dust and toxic gases pervaded the air in some mines due to the oppressively hot conditions and inadequate ventilation. Because of the heat and the dirt, miners frequently worked in their underwear, or in the early decades, actually completely nude. Pools and mud were constantly formed by the water seeping in. If the drainage pumps failed, flooding was a constant risk. And then there were the rats. So many rats, ubiquitous, drawn to the food scraps of miners or the stabled pit ponies. Typically, a miner's shift would last 10 to 12 hours, during which time they worked in near complete darkness, while the sound of picks and shovels reverberated through the tunnels. Sounds risky, doesn't it? Well, that's because it was. The shale or coal roof could suddenly give way at any time, burying miners, and cave-ins and roof collapses were common causes of harm or death. Falls down mine shafts were another deadly hazard, and many miners entered shafts using flimsy lifts or ladders. If a lamp spark ignited the buildup of flammable gas, at the time called fire damp, it was mostly methane, it could cause a catastrophic explosion, and pockets of carbon dioxide, known as choke damp, could suddenly suffocate workers below. I love those Victorian names, fire damp and choke damp. As early gas detectors, miners frequently carried those caged canaries. I'm sure you're familiar with the image. If the bird collapsed, well, that was indication to leave. Miners had to deal with crippling lung conditions over time. Chronic bronchitis and black lung were caused by breathing in constant amounts of coal dust. Persistently hunched posture led to debilitating joint and back issues. Coal miners' lives were remarkably brief in the 1840s, according to investigators. Many of them passed away from illness or accidents in the 30s or early 40s. In fact, the British coal miner had an average life expectancy of only 36 years by the middle of the 19th century, which was significantly less than the national average. Tragic events such as frequent floods or fire damp explosions were also frequent and occasionally killed dozens in a single explosion. Of course, the poor old children did not fare much better. Spending too much time in the dark stunted their growth and harmed their health. Ironically, coal mining might have paid more than some other manual labor occupations during that era. Not much, but it was okay if you wanted to break your back for it. A productive family team could make a modest living because miners were paid per ton of coal. Compared to many farm laborers or factory workers, a skilled adult collier might earn between 15 and 25 shillings per week, but of course this varied by region and coal price. But these salaries, of course, came with a much higher cost. In addition, mine owners had a lot of control over the miners' lives. Families were frequently required to rent company-owned housing, which was deducted from their pay, and they frequently had to use credit to purchase goods at a company store. The family might become impoverished overnight if the father was hurt or the mine was temporarily shut down. Later in the century, strikes for safety improvements and higher wages were common, but miners in the early Victorian era had little bargaining power and no union protection. But there was a social perception element too. Coal miners were viewed differently in Victorian society. You see, on the one hand, miners were acknowledged for performing hard, necessary labour that heated homes, powered railroads and factories. Newspapers would hero miners after a disaster, and middle-class reformers who looked into mines were appalled by what they discovered, particularly when they saw the child labour situation. There was a rough respect for their toughness, too, and the risks that they faced. The Mines Act of 1842, which prohibited women and very young children from working in the mines, was the result of public pressure. Miners, on the other hand, were frequently viewed as an impolite underclass. They were secluded in their colliery villages, prone to strikes and viewed as rough or unruly by certain elites. Surely the same elites who were using that very same coal to heat their homes, I'm sure. They were occasionally stereotyped too by mainstream media as being rough or inebriated. However, the harsh conditions faced by the miners were brought to light by social reformers and the burgeoning labour movement by the late Victorian era. An iconic representation of the period's injustices and the human cost of industrial advancement is that very picture of the soot-blackened miner emerging from that miserable pit. So now we have the third occupation of our day, that is the Matchstick Maker. A little random, I know, but that's just what it is. The production of matchsticks, of course, was a major industry in the days before electric lighting, and was mostly the responsibility of young, poor women and girls. In factories, matchstick makers, often referred to simply as match girls, cut thin sticks of wood, dipped one end into a chemical mixture, and then created the match head. White phosphorus, which I'm sure you know is extremely toxic, was part of a matchtip formula in the Victorian era. And with that being said, you can see how we are leading into some problems. Teenage girls, some as young as 13 or 14, stood in long rows doing the same old things, boxing and drying matches, packing them for sale and dipping the splints into vats of phosphorus. They typically put in 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, with only short breaks. The work was completed quickly to fulfill quotas, while maintaining a high level of detail to prevent breaking the sticks. Hundreds of these workers were employed on assembly lines by factories, as the well-known Bryant and May in London. Match factories were extremely dangerous, claustrophobic, and ill-ventilated. White phosphorus fumes, which smell like garlic, by the way, frequently filled the air. Foremen enforced strict discipline, too, with fines imposed for minor infractions, little things such as talking or even dropping matches, and workers were forced to stand for hours with very little rest. In order to maintain production, the girls in some factories were even made to eat at their workstations. This implied that their food was frequently tainted by the toxic phosphorus that surrounded them. Everyone inhaled the vapor constantly. There was no idea of masks or proper ventilation. They just didn't know. Additionally, the chemical might get under the fingernails or splash onto the skin. The unhealthy atmosphere was exacerbated by the dust from dried matchsticks. Long hours were made even more gloomy by the low lighting, which was typically just daylight coming in through high windows or perhaps gas lamps. There may be wood shavings or chemical residue all over the floors, too. Many of the workers were already vulnerable and undernourished, having come from the East End slums of London, especially in the Bryant and May factory, which conditions, of course, made their health even worse. The most notorious risk associated with this work was known as phossy jaw, a horrifying industrial illness brought on by prolonged exposure to phosphorus. First, victims would have toothaches and swollen gums, followed by oral sores and abscesses. Osteonecrosis, or the actual rotting of the jawbone, would eventually result in glowing greenish white bone tissue, excruciating pain, tooth loss, and an unpleasant discharge from the gums. Facial disfigurement could result from the lower jaw's eventual death and disintegration. Many of the patients died from infections or organ failure brought on by the phosphorus, and their jawbones may be surgically removed to save their lives. And one could hardly imagine how the surgical removal would go back in those times. In the 19th century, phossy jaw affected dozens of match workers. In addition, workers frequently experienced respiratory issues from breathing in wood dust and chemicals, such as asthma, bronchitis, and persistent coughing. If exposure to phosphorus was severe, it could also result in systemic poisoning, which could cause symptoms like seizures or brain damage. Another risk was accidental fires or explosions if a worker accidentally struck a match, or if a batch of white phosphorus dried incorrectly, it could ignite. A small fire could of course quickly grow into a conflagration in a workshop that is so densely populated and filled with flammable materials. Numerous matchgirls had burn scars from mishaps at work. On the factory floor, fainting episodes were caused by the long hours and malnutrition. All things considered, it was probably one of the riskiest manufacturing operations in Victorian Britain. Matchgirls received infamously low pay too, which is no surprise. I'm sure you've seen the trend. A typical match factory worker in the mid-1880s made only 4 to 8 shillings per week, which is equivalent to 60 to 70 hours of work. Many workers and their families lived on the verge of starvation because this was hardly enough for subsistence. Additionally, employers frequently docked pay with fines. For instance, if an employee was a few minutes late, they might lose half of their day's pay and may be withheld to cover any damaged goods. Because of dire circumstances, the Bryant and May matchgirls famously went on strike in 1888. Hundreds of matchstick makers demonstrated against their poor wages and appalling conditions with the aid of social activist Annie Besant. Pay did remain low, even after the strike brought about some improvements, such as the elimination of fines and a slight increase in wages. But despite their meager pay, many matchgirls served as their families' main providers. Victorian society and factory owners justified the extremely low wages by claiming that the work was unskilled woman's work. Prior to the 1888 strike, matchstick makers were regarded as the lowest strata of society, or were mainly invisible to polite society. Poor working-class girls, they were frequently written off as nothing more than factory drudges. Newspapers and medical journal began to cover this matchmaker's disease. The startling deformity of phossy jaw victims did gradually bring attention to their predicament. The strike by the matchgirls itself was a watershed moment because it attracted sympathy and extensive media coverage. Teenage girls' ability to band together and challenge the influential factory owners shocked the middle-class Victorians. Following the strike, the matchgirls came to represent the early labor movement against the struggle that sweated industries exploited the people through. Society's perception on them was somewhat improved by their increased visibility. They were no longer seen as helpless victims of an industrial disease, but rather as courageous young ladies demanding simply equitable treatment. Nonetheless, all this considered, A match factory girl in Victorian London would frequently be despised on a daily basis for being impoverished and crude. The awful stereotype of the fussy-jawed match girl did not start to disappear from popular culture until the early 20th century, when white phosphorus was finally outlawed and safety precautions were put in place. And at number 4, perhaps you'll consider this as your opportunity to gain your riches. Rat catchers. These workers made a living by eliminating the disease-carrying rodents that plagued Victorian cities. Hunting and catching rats in residences, workplaces, sewers, and streets, well, that was their responsibility. And they used a variety of strategies, such as keeping ferrets or small terrier dogs trained to chase rats out of their hiding spots. Some cleverly lured rats by applying sweet-smelling oils to their skin with their bare hands. They would search barns, city cellars, or haystacks, snatching rodents as they scurried away. In addition, rat trappers set traps to make their own poisons, which they sold on the side. It's not a bad little side hustle, isn't it? Because live rats were frequently sold to public figures or event planners for use in rat-baiting pits, a gruesome spectator sport in which dogs were timed on how quickly they killed dozens of rats. Yes, they had that sort of thing. It was possible to make money by catching rats alive rather than killing them. Kind of like a modern-day Colosseum for animals, I suppose. As a result, a Victorian rat trapper might keep a cage of live rats for sale, or use of the public poisoning of one of 2 rats as an advertisement to show off the potency of his poison. Jack Black. Not that one. We're talking about Queen Victoria's rat catcher, and other well-known rat catchers made a show of their work by putting on brightly colored costumes and showcasing cages filled with hundreds of live rats. It doesn't sound very impressive. Imagine your friend pulls one of them out when you go over for dinner. These hunters, of course, followed rats everywhere, from the most vile city sewers to the luxurious basements of Buckingham Palace. Since rats were most active at night or early in the morning, they frequently worked during these times. The surroundings were dangerous and dirty, of course. In search of a scuttling rodent, a rat catcher may scuttle beneath floors, into garbage piles, or down into the sewer manholes. They had to contend with savage, biting rats in cramped, dimly lit areas. Many only had a candle or lantern with them for illumination. For those working in the city's slums, the smell of sewage and decay was a constant companion. Rat catchers were accustomed to handling wriggling, squealing rats and getting rid of carcasses, so it was certainly not a job for the faint of heart. Furthermore, after capturing the rats, they had to move them, possibly in dozens in wooden cages or burlap sacks, until they could either sell them or find somewhere to put them to death. Just imagine it. You can picture yourself carrying this sack full of live, screeching rats over your shoulder, walking home after a long day of sweaty and disgusting labor. Say what you want about our modern work conditions, but I would not swap them for that. Undoubtedly a disagreeable circumstance. Of course, the work never really ended. They would be out rain or shine, because the infestations never stopped. A certain daring willingness to go anywhere a rat could go was necessary for this job. Now, in terms of occupational hazards, you can imagine that you would often get painful rat bites. And believe me, their jaws are quite strong. Not that I've been bitten by a rat, touch wood, but I know a bit about it. When cornered, scared rats would give ferocious bites and scratches, which frequently resulted in infected wounds. Even a minor bite could result in a serious infection or illness like rat bite fever if modern antibiotics are not available. And guess what? They weren't. Many rat catchers became ill as a result of handling the rats, which also exposed them to diseases spread by fleas and rodents. The exact link between these diseases and diseases like typhus or plague at the time was not fully understood, germ theory still within its infancy. Now, the actual work environment, alleys, stables, sewers, meant ongoing and brutal exposure to pathogens and filth. In order to kill rats, too, some rat catchers used toxic chemicals, such as strychnine or arsenic, which could, of course, poison the rat catcher himself if handled improperly. There was also the risk of mishap tripping and breaking a limb in a dark cellar, or getting ambushed by angry property owners or guard dogs while skulking around at night. Regarding rat baiting, a rat catcher who kept and sold live rats was at risk of suffering severe bites when moving the rats from one cage to another or into a fighting pit. These bites would have the potential to spread infections that result in sepsis and extreme swelling. Even though some showman rat catchers were brash, many probably had scars on their hands and arms from years of being nipped and scratched. Perhaps they built up an immunity. But to put it briefly, there was a chance of suffering and illness with every rat hunt. As far as the wages, catching rats may be more of a feast or famine situation. Some received a fixed fee per job or per rat killed while working under contract for wealthy estates or city authorities. Others worked as freelancers, charging homeowners to remove pests or selling rats for baiting. Catching dozens of rats in a day could earn a few shillings, because prices may be a few pence per rat. 50 rats in a barn could be cleared by a competent rat catcher with a good dog, earning a respectable day's wage. For example, Jack Black stated that he once provided 2,000 live rats for a rat baiting event. You can certainly see how you could get onto the grind with this kind of work. Ingenious rat trappers also produced and marketed rat poison. Showcasing a poison in the marketplace by immediately killing a rat could increase sales, but the income was not consistent, as infestations fluctuated seasonally, and there were days where there was very little work. As a result, many rat catchers led precarious lives, making ends meet in any way they could. Notably, Jack Black could have been more on a steady wicket due to his unofficial royal appointment, and the fact that apparently he sold fancy-colored pet rats. Now that is interesting. However, the average rat catcher, the man on the street, led a modest life, spending a large portion of their income on supplies. We're talking dogs, ferrets, and ingredients for poison, as well as likely medical expenses due to all the bites. Of course, rat catchers were viewed with ambivalence by society. On one hand, they served a vital public function during a time where rats posed a threat to food supplies and public health. They were viewed as courageous, or perhaps insane, individuals who were prepared to perform menial tasks that others simply shied away from. They were fascinatingly portrayed in Henry Mayhew's interviews for London Labour and the London Poor, particularly the quirky Jack Black, who was kind of a folk hero of sorts, especially among the lower classes. Jack Black's semi-official role stems from the fact that even Queen Victoria's court recognized the necessity of having a rat catcher in the residence. Rat catchers, on the other hand, frequently had low social standing. Their work exposed them to the underclass and made them smell of filth. They could be compared to renegades or outlaws who prowl the streets at strange hours. Their exploits probably piqued interest but also disgust of the general public. The Victorian rat catcher was seen as a gritty but necessary character. A refined person would certainly not invite him around to dinner, but he was respected for his practicality, a necessary unpleasantry. They were frequently portrayed as half scavenger, half entrepreneur in the literature and newspapers of the era. And all in all, through all the unfortunate realities of the job, they made city life just that little bit more tolerable by being brave enough to take on the rodent hordes, and perhaps, for some people with a stomach for it, a little bit more entertaining in those rat pit fights. Alright, so the last one for today is the night soil man, also known as the sewer cleaner. Oh, we certainly leave the best to last, don't we? Well, here we go. Of course, cities relied on outhouses and cesspools prior to the invention of modern sewers. The night soil men were responsible for the unpleasant duty of emptying these. After all, someone had to do it. It was the responsibility of a night soil man to gather and transport human waste, which of course they gave the name night soil to make it a little bit more pleasant. These would gather in privies and cesspits during the dead of night. They came with shovels, buckets and carts after midnight, working in teams. One man, known as the holeman, would stand in the privy or dip into the cesspit to scoop the vicious sludge of human waste into tubs. The full tubs would be lifted by his partners and dumped into a big barrel or cart. To get to the cesspool underneath, they frequently had to pry up floorboards or open access holes as they moved from building to building and house to house. By daybreak, they dragged the foul-smelling carts, sometimes pulled by horses, sometimes pushed by hand, out of the city to farms or disposal sites. The waste could be spread as fertilizer in rural areas. In London, some of it was sold to farmers as manure. The others were processed to make chemicals. Strength, coordination, and don't forget the iron stomach, all necessary for the job. They say you can get used to anything, but I don't know. In an effort to empty as many cesspits as possible before dawn, teams of 4 frequently worked in coordinated unison to clear one cesspit effectively before swiftly moving on to the next. The overall working environment, you can imagine, was unbelievably filthy. With the exception of faint lantern light, the men frequently worked in complete darkness, while knee-deep in human filth. In addition to the fact that the waste smelled a little less in the colder night air, they worked in the cold to avoid the public's attention, and perhaps the public's retching. The stench was still overpowering. Householders frequently offered a bottle of gin as a token of appreciation to the night soil crew, probably as much as a courtesy to help them tolerate the stench. The night soilmen frequently smeared tobacco or ointment under their noses to try and deal with it, and they wore tattered, old clothes, because the waste would simply ruin them. With sloshing carts, they lumbered through tiny alleys, occasionally dumping trash onto the streets. After years of accumulation, their work sites or cesspits could be in yards or basements, were frequently overflowing and neglected. Imagine using a shovel that slips in the slime while standing in a pit, walls literally covered in excrement. Although many landlords and residents needed the service, they were still despised by everyone who saw them. These pits also contained hazardous conditions, such as methane and ammonia fumes. The men were soaked with foul matter and exhausted from hours of heaving full tubs. By morning, they may be completely covered in God knows what, and need to hose themselves as well as their tools clean before going to bed. Surely The wives would not want them coming in wearing that, I can imagine. And there was also a genuine chance of contracting an illness or dying in an accident. Cesspools were dangerous places where a digger could be overcome by poisonous gases such as sulphurous or methane and either die or lose consciousness. Such incidents continued to happen in Victorian times, as evidenced by the grim tale of Richard the Raker, a worker who literally drowned in human sewage while on the job centuries ago. Rest in peace to that poor soul, and I mean it. The muck itself was contaminated with parasites, cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. Despite the late Victorian era's acceptance of germ theory, night soilmen were naturally aware that exposure to raw sewage could cause severe illness. Many experienced persistent nausea, headaches, and lung problems as a result of breathing in vapors that were high in ammonia. Hernias, strained backs, and other injuries resulted from the strenuous physical labor of lifting heavy tubs and shoveling tons of waste. Additionally, they had to work in slick, awkward conditions where a slip could result in a broken limb or a plunge into the cesspit. A man's weight could cause a cesspit wall or floor to collapse if it were unstable. Furthermore, night soil workers frequently suffered from infected cuts or skin conditions as a result of improperly sanitary waste handling. After years of work, it was not unusual for them to completely lose their sense of smell. The average night soilman's health unavoidably suffered under the assault of human waste and exhausting nightly toil, even though there was some protection from the strong constitutions and excessive gin consumption, but perhaps that just made things worse. One might anticipate that this job would pay well, and it did, at least by those working-class standards of Victorian times. The night soilmen in London charged around a shilling per cesspit emptied by the middle of the 19th century. In comparison to other labour, this was extremely profitable. Remember the matchstick girls only making 7 to 8 shillings per week. A skilled tradesman's daily wage was about a shilling, though, so a team that emptied multiple cesspools a night could earn a few shillings, which is equivalent to several days' pay in a single night. Their pay was at least twice of that of the average skilled labourer, according to Henry Mayhew. People only emptied cesspits when they filled up, which may have happened a few times a year per building, so the work was irregular. However, a night soilman may have weeks where he is very busy, and then times where he is not. However, some seasoned night workers made enough to live a little better than the poorest workers. Some even bought off officials or police to get the best routes. However, the high salary comes at a high cost. Some men used a large portion of their income to buy alcohol as a coping mechanism, and the negative health effects of the job could shorten their working years. Notably, cities started making investments in sewer systems in the 1840s and 50s as cholera outbreaks were raging. The old-fashioned night soilman began to become obsolete as the underground sewers grew, as the Basildgate system in London after 1858, known as the Great Stink. Yes, when the old river had dried up and all of the horrors of it were just scattered along the banks. Anyway, many people lost what had been a filthy but comparatively lucrative job. At the periphery of Victorian society, night soilmen were both essential and despised. The need to stop overflowing cesspools in crowded neighborhoods was reluctantly accepted by city authorities and landlords. However, they were completely shunned. They worked covertly whenever possible, and there were mere mention of their job. Well, that could make the stomach turn. The fact that they were referred to as nightmen or night soilmen suggests that the society would rather they be kept hidden away Out of sight, out of mind. Very few would shake their hand, but they might get paid, sure. Nevertheless, the workers and other lower-class labourers, such as dustmen and toshers, which we will get to in the second part, shared a certain sinister camaraderie. They established a subculture with a rough reputation of its own. They are independent contractors, on the very edge of an almost legitimate economy. It's interesting to note that some Victorians were aware of the night soilmen when they were discussing public health issues. Reformers used the ridiculous condition of cesspools and the limitations of using night soil collection to support their calls for modern sewers, and it was very hard to argue against. Society essentially bid farewell to an unsightly necessity by replacing their jobs with the new sewers, thanks to Bazalgette. All things considered, Victorians viewed the night soil man as a rough, unclean person who was needed until the improved sanitation arrived, sometimes pitying him for performing such squalid labor. Their lives spent in knee-deep muck to keep everyone else clean. What do you think? Does that make them the unsung heroes of sanitation? Or perhaps the unsung martyrs? Well, the unsung heroes of this channel allow me to sing their praises, the patrons and supporters. That is Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulf, Nia, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Video Man, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, the HMSHH, Crystal, and Towery. Now remember, if you want to see part 2, let me know in the comments. Because, well, I'm going to make it anyway, but just leave a comment. It's good for the algorithm, okay? Good night, everyone. And I hope that you can look at your job with a little bit more of a positive outlook after listening to these. As always, lots of love to you all. Good night.